All right, now we're sitting here with a gentleman that really needs no introduction to anybody who's been a fan of ufology or a fan of the topic of UFOs, a fan of the unknown, the unexplained, that has to do with aliens. The one and the only Mr. Stanton Friedman, who also, by the way, was the second person I ever interviewed on radio. And when I contacted him, I was shaking like a leaf. I was just shaking. This man is never going to say yes to me. He's going to, just hang up the phone. And he was so nice to be on the air with us. He's been on a couple of shows that I've been either a producer or a host on, and it's an honor and a pleasure to finally meet you in person. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for being a part here and shaking my hand. And, tell the audience a little bit about yourself in case they've been living in the rock somewhere. They don't know who Stanton Friedman is at this point. Just give us a little rundown of your history.
Okay, I grew up in New Jersey. It wasn't my fault, but I had to go in this. And I spent 2 years at Rutgers University and then 3 years at the University of Chicago. Carl Sagan and I were classmates for 3 years. Then I went to work in industry, and in 14 years I worked for several major companies. My specialty was canceled government-sponsored research and development programs. General Electric Aircraft Nuclear Propulsion Department. Worked there in 1958. We spent $100 million. It wasn't a small program. Employed 3,700 people, of whom 1,100 were engineers and scientists. Then the program got canceled. Worked for Urja General Nucleonics, worked on fusion study, fusion propulsion, way back in '62. Worked for General Motors on a compact nuclear reactor program, and wound up at Westinghouse Astronuclear Lab working on nuclear rocket engines. And we tested them on the ground. Unfortunately, not in space. Yeah. And I wound up, I was, crazy world, how things happen. I gave my first lecture in 1967 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in somebody's living room. I'd gotten to know Frank Edwards, who wrote a book, Flying Saucers Serious Business, which he had given me a copy of. And when I got to Pittsburgh as a Westinghouse nuclear scientist, I called Frank and said, I need some names, Frank. You know everybody. I'd like to go public. So he gave me some names, and one of them was a producer of a radio show called Contact. And I called them thinking, Westinghouse is big in Pittsburgh, and so they'll certainly want me on. Don't call us, we'll call you. Less than a month later, they called me at 6:30. Could I do the 7 o'clock show, please? Somebody had canceled at the last minute. And I lived near the station. By then, you didn't do it by phone. You went down in person. Yes. So I did that. Somebody at work at Westinghouse heard me and said, her book review club is reading Frank's book. Could I give them a talk about flying saucers in her living room? That was my first lecture. And I did a bunch more lectures, did KDKA more, that program several times. And things happen in crazy ways. I'm riding to work one of 2 days. I rode to work. I worked in a small town called Large, Pennsylvania, outside of Pittsburgh. And I lived downtown, and I needed to take my car to the garage. A woman who worked at the same place, Westinghouse Astronuclear Lab, was also lived downtown, so she gave me a ride. And I was talking to her, Jerry, I'd like to speak at Carnegie Mellon University. I'd already given a number of talks. And she said, well, did you talk to the dean? No, I talked to Dr. So-and-so, and he wasn't interested. She said, Stan, the dean's my husband. He's heard you on the radio. Give him a call. Okay, so I called Gene, her husband, and we booked a talk, but it was going to be during the day, so I'd have to take some time off work. And the last question was, how much do you want? How about $100? Thinking he'd cut me down to 50, but then because I knew his wife, he told me what he was paying the other speakers in the series. $1,500, $1,700. What? Well, the nice thing was the talk went extremely well, and he sent a letter to the agent agency through whom he had booked the other speakers. And they booked me at the Engineering Society of Detroit, which was $300 plus expenses, and they were sold out 3 weeks in advance for 1,008 people for dinner and a talk, and there were no negative questions. And I couldn't help but respect the Engineering Society of Detroit, even though I buy Japanese cars. So I did work for General Motors for 3 years. Anyway, I got started, and then we had a very successful test of a nuclear rocket engine, and the program was canceled. Don't ask me to explain that, because yes, but looking for a job, and I got a job working for McDonnell Douglas Astronautics for somebody who was here at this conference. This is in 1969. Dr. Robert M. Wood is here. And I got a job which was supposed to be, believe it or not, trying to figure out how flying saucers work. They had a little extra money on the Manned Orbiting Laboratory program, which was a big program. And so I'm driving across the country to take my new job, and I hear on the radio that the Manned Orbiting Laboratory program had been canceled. I walk in, you realize we just laid off 5,000 people, is what the gal says to me. Great start. They kept me for 3 months, but that got me determined. I've got a family to feed and so forth, and so I was on the phone calling back east early in the morning because it's cheap, 3-hour time difference, and I've been a ufologist ever since. But it's a crazy path to get there, It's not what I expected. When I worked my way through 5 years at college, I was a union waiter in Chicago. You got to belong to the union in Chicago no matter what you do. I was a busboy in the Catskills. You ever know about the Catskills? So all this time, since then, that was about 1970. That's a long time. I've given well over 700 lectures in 50 states, 10 provinces, and 18 other countries. 19 coming up. I'm going to be in Hungary. Bulgaria. I've been in Hungary. This is Bulgaria. You're serving dinner for this program? Anyway, I'm best known, I suppose, because I'm the original civilian investigator of the Roswell incident. Started that in 1978 just by accident, being in the right place. Well, because of a late reporter. Crazy things again. I was supposed to do 3 interviews when I was speaking at Baton Rouge, Louisiana, at LSU, Louisiana State University. And I was supposed to do 3 interviews. I did the first 2, and the third reporter was nowhere to be found. This is 1978. And the station manager, he's giving me coffee. He's looking at his watch. He knew the people brought me to the station and so forth. And out of the blue, he says, the guy you ought to talk to is Jesse Marcel. And brilliant investigator that I am, I said, what should I talk to him about? Who's he? What do you know about him? Well, his next sentence changed my life. He handled records from one of those saucers you were interested in when he was in the military. What? He wasn't laughing. This was not a joke. Yeah. What do you know about him? He lives in Houma. That didn't tell me anything. They didn't know where Houma was. Well, I did my interview. The reporter showed up. And then things went extremely well that day at LSU and that night. The next morning, I was at the airport early. I was flying someplace else for a lecture. I thought, why don't we see if we can find this Jesse Marcel? Because things went so well the day before, what the heck? So I called information. People used to do that when you didn't have computers, And I called information, got a number for Jesse Marcel, and he told me his story. I mentioned Bill Allen, the guy at the television station, and so forth. And it intrigued the heck out of me because Jesse sounded very sharp. People said, well, why did he talk to you? I thought this was all secret. He was indeed the base intelligence officer for the most unique military group in the world, the 509th. They're the first ones to drop an atomic bomb. Roswell was the home of 509. And Jesse talked to me. His name had been in newspapers. I didn't know this at the time. So I followed up, talked to a colleague, Bill Moore. We wound up locating 62 people within a year connected with the Roswell incident. Jesse told me about somebody bringing wreckage into the base, and it's talking to them, and it got me started. That was 1978. And I've spoken at all the Roswell festival, UFO festivals, except two. One, I had a heart attack, and I couldn't get there. And the other one, we had a family event going. And I'll be there next week, as a matter of fact. Labor Day weekend, they're having some festivities. You realize, to give you an indication of the interest in the subject, the International UFO Museum and Research Center in Roswell last year had 184,000 visitors. Roswell's a town of less than 50,000, and it's not on the way to anywhere. It's 200 miles from Albuquerque, 200 miles from Amarillo, 200 miles from El Paso. So if you're there, it's because you want to be there. And everywhere I've lectured in the world, people ask me about Roswell. So it's a major draw. It's a destination. People bring their kids, and all this sort of thing. So I've been doing this for a long time. I've done debates at Oxford University Debating Society. We won the debate. I debated Seth Shostak on Coast to Coast Radio. He's with the SETI community. SETI stands for Silly Effort to Investigate. You have to get that in there. Well, it does. It makes no sense.
SETI is looking at spectrums that humans use, but if you're talking about extraterrestrial race from another universe that might be light years more advanced than us, who's to say they're even using these kind of technology stuff? I mean, it's ridiculous to think that's what we're going to find.
There isn't the slightest evidence that anybody's sending us signals. But they refuse to look at the UFO data where we have a tremendous amount of evidence that aliens are visiting. That's crazy. Are you interested in aliens or aren't you? Kind of thing. So I've done debates. I'm a strong voice for my four major conclusions since 1958. That's a long time. 58 years of study and investigation. One, the evidence is overwhelming that planet Earth is being visited by intelligently controlled extraterrestrial spacecraft. In other words, some, underlined 36 times, some UFOs are alien spacecraft. Remember, the question isn't, are all UFOs flying saucers or alien spacecraft? The question is, are any? My answer is yes. Overwhelming evidence. Second conclusion is we're dealing with a cosmic Watergate. By that I mean I've worked under security for 14 years. I know about security. I had to keep clearance, working on nuclear projects and so forth. And it's clear that there are people in the government who know a heck of a lot about flying saucers that they're not telling us. For example, I shock people by pointing out that, and I show them pictures, I showed one here the other day. The NSA, National Security Agency, has released 156 pages of top-secret Umbra NSA UFO documents. You can read one sentence per page. Everything else is whited out. We've got a lot of CIA UFO documents. They released about 800 secret up through secret. And then I managed to get them to release some more top-secret ones. They're all blacked out. Some of them you can read six words on a page. Yeah. And so the second conclusion, we're dealing with a cosmic Watergate. That doesn't mean everybody in government knows what's going on. That's not how security works. The third conclusion is there are no good arguments against the first two conclusions. And the fourth conclusion is we're dealing with the biggest story of the millennium. I don't say 2 millennia because I don't want to get in an argument about religion and so forth. The Earth is being visited. We've withheld the best data, bodies and wreckage. And so I come on very strong. I've only had 11 hecklers. 2 of them were drunk. And the audience took care of the others, basically. So it's been one hell of a life since 1958 when I read the first book I'd ever read on the subject. And what really pushed me was I got angry. I had read 10 books. Read the first one was the report on unidentified flying objects by Edward Ruppelt, who headed Project Blue Book in the early 50s. And I was intrigued. I mean, I was working on nuclear airplanes, and our work was classified and so forth, but I was intrigued. I shared it with a neighbor. Charlie was 10 years older than I was and was a good engineer, and he was more impressed than I was, and that impressed me. 10 years later, Charlie and his wife attended a lecture I gave at an electrical engineering group in Connecticut. And the first thing they said to me, we knew you when you didn't believe in flying saucers, which was comforting. Anyway, I moved away to California. I read 10 books and then made a serendipitous discovery, I guess, at the University of California, Berkeley Library. I found a copy of Project Blue Book, Special Report 14. I have a few copies here, as a matter of fact. Largest study ever done for the United States Air Force. And I was surprised because it hadn't been mentioned in any of the 10 books I'd read. And because it was chock full of tables, graphs, charts, maps. I'm a data hound. And because they included the press release that went out when it was completed in 1955. It was an Air Force report. But the press release, the Secretary of the Air Force, what higher authority can you get, said, on the basis of this study, we believe that no objects such as those popularly described as flying saucers have overflown the United States. Even the unknown 3% could have been identified as conventional phenomena if more complete observational data had been available. That sounds very straightforward, and Pat, there's a little problem. The unknowns were 21.5%, not 3%. That's not 3 rounded off. And yes, and they did a cross comparison between the unknowns and everything else. The knowns found that the probability that the unknowns, the only ones we're interested in, are just misknowns was less than 1%. They did a quality evaluation of all the sightings, 3,201 sightings. That's a good sample. And they found the better the quality of the sighting, because of the background of the observer, the circumstance, the more likely to be unexplainable. Just what you'd expect if these things were legitimate, you know. So when I found that report, it really made me angry. I don't like being lied to by the Secretary of the Air Force, and by anybody, but especially in such a high position. And I was determined I was going to find out more about what's really going on here. This is too big a conflict between the facts and what was stated. So I joined APRO and NICAP, the two big UFO groups back then, to get their newsletters. And was reading and so forth and studying. And then I got to know Frank Edwards, who wrote Flying Saucers Serious Business, and I asked him for some names, and I gave my first lecture as a result of doing a radio show in Pittsburgh, where I asked them at the last minute. I called, and no, we're not interested. And then they called me because somebody canceled. So it's a strange path to ufology, and I've been involved in movies, and I'm the Grandma Moses of the UFO book writing business. I didn't write my first book until after I was 60 years old. You know? I just put out the newest one. The pub date is September 19th, but they arranged for several boxes to be shipped directly from the printer to us here, and we sold just about all of them. Yeah. So life does strange things, and I had a clue on a college application way back when. They asked, what did you do in high school that gave you the most satisfaction? And I said, being in 2 plays in my senior year. And the only reason I was in those plays is because the principal of the high school, Linden, New Jersey, had a conflict with the head of the debating society. I'd been in debating for 3 years. I was on a state championship debating team. But the program was canceled the last year because they couldn't get along. So I got to do something with my time. I had spent a lot of time on debating. So I went out for 2 plays. And one of them, to find out, my dad was bald from the time I knew him. And they were going to make my hair gray because I played a priest, if you believe that. Oh, wow. what's a nice Jewish boy doing playing a priest, you know? But I enjoyed being on the stage, and I enjoyed the debating, so this is... and I have a basic rule, which I enunciated in the program I gave the other day. Have facts in hand before putting mouth in gear. That's the first rule for ufologists, I think. And that came about because in grammar school, Miss Cutkin, fifth grade teacher, was telling us in a science section, this was a long time ago, that the sun stands still and the planets move around the sun. And I had just read in our volume a month encyclopedia, I think it was 50 cents a volume, bought at the supermarket, that the whole solar system is moving around the center of the galaxy. 12 miles a second. That seemed horribly fast, you know. And she gave me a hard time. I wasn't used to a teacher giving me a hard time. I was a straight-A student. And so the next day I brought in the volume of the encyclopedia. And she reluctantly admitted that, well, maybe that was the case. Well, you know, I went to my high school 50th year reunion, and I mentioned that there's a movie about Stanton Friedman is real, and I mentioned Miss Gutkin and stuff. And my friend says, oh, she's still alive. She comes to services at the synagogue from time to time. Well, I was planning on going the next day, so I went, and she was there. 50 years. You know, it was more than 50 years. 50 years since high school. No, she remembered my uncle, though, and my cousins. He was a doctor or something, you know, the city doctor. But, you know, it's true. Have facts in hand before putting mouth in gear. And I think people have appreciated that with me. I try not to speculate. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I talk about what I know about. And if I don't know, I don't talk. And I think it's very important for both. I wish the debunkers would do it, because they don't get the facts straight. But even those of us in ufology, like the attendees at the Mufon conferences, need to be careful about making claims without having... There are a lot of interesting stories, but a story is not evidence. You know, and so I think that's very important.
It's funny you say that, because I actually got into it a little bit with Steve Bassett, who's a close friend, not long ago. Where he says there's so many stories that you can take that to court and that's evidence. And I say, well, stories are stories. Hard evidence is hard evidence. And you can have a billion stories, but that doesn't mean any of that is true.
So right. And I take pride in the fact that I've been to 20 archives, document archives, some of them many times, like the Eisenhower Library, the Truman Library, National Archives, and stuff like that. And it's come up in the crazy context of the MJ-12 story. One of the important documents is a memo from Bobby Cutler, who was Ike's national security advisor, to General Twining, who went on to be the chief of staff of the Air Force. And Philip Klass, who was the noisiest of the negativists and naysaying guys, senior avionics editor for Aviation Week and Space Technology. And he challenged me on that document because maybe you didn't notice it was done in the large pica type. This is from back in the late 40s. I challenge you to find any other document done in the same size and style type, because the National Security Council used only elite type, and he had 10 documents to prove it. He offered me $100 each for every genuine document, up to a maximum of 10. Well, I was going to the Eisenhower Library. I'd been there already. The first thing I did was go to my files, because knowing Phil, I didn't trust anything he said. And I dug out 20 pages done in pica type, just stuff that I'd gotten when I'd been there, you know. So I was going there anyway. I found 14 documents that met all his criteria, sent him a set and an invoice for $1,000, because he said a limit of 10. And he paid me. But he didn't tell anybody about paying me, and there is no Friedman file in the class papers at the American Philosophical Society Library. We corresponded for 20 years, for God's sakes. I don't think he wanted anybody to know that he paid me, you know. But the crazy thing is, I checked with the Eisenhower Library, and they keep track of who visits there. research interests and stuff like that. Phil had never been there before or after the claim. They got 250,000 pages of National Security Council materials, and he's going to generalize from 9 or 10, Typical of the intellectual bankruptcy of the pseudoscience of anti-ufology. I like the way that sounds. Rolls off my tongue. So I try to make sure that we stick to the facts. And stories aren't facts. They're not evidence. And so there are several other instances. There were a number of claims made about the same memo, false claims. Well, it doesn't have a signature on it. Well, it's true it doesn't have a signature. He was out of the country at the time. But I have the instructions that he left for James Lay and somebody else. He was executive secretary of the National Security Council, to keep things moving out of his inbox while he was gone. And I asked the Truman Library, is there anybody still alive, this is a number of years ago, from that time frame? Yeah, George Elsey. He was with Truman the whole time he was in the White House. So they said he's alive. He lives in the Washington, D.C. area. They didn't tell me where he was precisely. I located him, called him, asked if I could send him some strange documents that I don't know whether they're legitimate or not, and then call him back after he's had a chance to look at them. Sure, nice guy. He went on to be head of the American Red Cross, as a matter of fact. And I sent him the documents. Then I called him. And it was the craziest feeling. Just before I called him, I realized if he knows anything, he can't tell me anything. You've got to ask my questions, not are the documents genuine. Did you see anything about the documents that would lead you to believe they were phony? The list of people who were on Majestic 12, you knew who all those people were. Oh, yes. Do you have any reason to believe that Truman didn't like those people or wouldn't have called on them if something like this had happened? You don't have to say something did happen, but just those people. No, they're the right people. And he was extremely helpful to me. And I can't find other people who go to look for first-hand testimony. People complain. One of my great discoveries, in quotes, was that Donald Menzel, who was a total debunker of UFOs, wrote 3 anti-UFO books. He was professor of astronomy at Harvard, no less. It says that he was a member of this Majestic 12 group. But he was a debunker. His first book got translated into Russian. Well, that's right. And it made no sense. So I checked, well, it's a legitimate question. And that's one of the reasons we didn't go public with the MJ-12 documents. We're waiting for somebody to say, gotcha, So when looking at somebody else's papers, Dr. Vannevar Bush, who was basically Roosevelt's science advisor and then Truman as well, I found a letter in his files from an attorney in Boston thanking him for all his help in getting charges dropped against Donald Menzel for disloyalty and trying to take away his security clearance. What? Why did he have a security clearance? You don't need a security clearance to teach astronomy at Harvard. I called Harvard. Yes, they had his papers, but you can't look at them unless you get permission from 3 different people. They gave me the names. I wrote the letters. I got permission. I went there, and I knew a lot of his papers were the American Philosophical Society Library in Philadelphia, his UFO correspondence. But, so I'm looking there. I'm at the Harvard archives, and there's a file listed in a whole long list of things, JFK. Wonder what that's all about. I had pay dirt. He and Menzel knew each other because his area of interest, JFK's, was astronomy. They even had breakfast together on occasion. And there's a letter from Menzel to John F. Kennedy saying, there's one area where I may be able to be of help for you. This is after the election. He was on Scientists for Kennedy, a promotion group, if you will. that's with regard to the National Security Agency. I've had a longer continuous association with them than anybody. When we are properly cleared to each other, I can tell you more. So here we have, it turns out he was a world-class cryptologist. Nobody knew that. And he did all kinds of classified work for various and sundry agencies. Well, the funny thing is, I published an article about my findings, the double life of Donald Menzel, and I had a number of people say, oh, he couldn't have let a double life stand, he was a debunker. Well, none of them had gone to the Harvard archives to look at his papers. And you don't have to look far for double lives. Burgess, Philby, and McLean were three famous Russian spies who worked for British intelligence. That takes a lot of careful tiptoeing around, you know. So my discovery about Menzel, I found out two things. Nobody had known about it until well after his death. And an article was published a few years ago about the cryptologic contributions of Donald Menzel. Code breaking, that's what the NSA does, of course. But it was a good example of the need to get facts in hand. I mean, I went there, I didn't know what I was going to find, and I struck pay dirt. There were several things. And I thought that was an important discovery because it illustrates the problem, the need to go after, let's get to the facts, man. And I'm convinced, there's another memo that was very important, the Bollinger memo. General Carol Bollinger, Air Force General, was a good engineer working on the Lunar Excursion Module in 1969 when we landed on the moon, you may recall. Well, I don't know if you're old enough to recall that, but
I'm not, but I've seen it.
The Air Force, the University of Colorado study, the Condon report, had recommended that Project Blue Book, Air Force Project Blue Book, be closed because it wasn't contributing anything to science and intelligence work. So General Bollinger was asked by the Air Force, what should we do about Project Blue Book? He had no previous connection with it, and we had landed on the moon, so he wasn't working 12-hour days, he told me. I called him. We didn't see this memo until 10 years later. In the memo, he said, reports of UFOs which could affect national security are not part of the Blue Book system, which is an astonishing statement. They're the only ones we really want to know about. And 2 paragraphs later, he says, if we close Project Blue Book, which was closed as a result of his memo, the public won't have any place to report sightings. However, as previously noted, reports which could affect national security, there are procedures designed for their utilization. So they're looking at reports which could affect national security, even though Blue Book's been closed. So I located General Bollinger, this is 10 years later, and said, it seems, I explained I'd had a Q clearance for 14 years and so forth, but I was very interested in his memo, and I said, it seems to me you're saying there are 2 separate communication channels. One for reports which could affect national security, like the one I had just a couple weeks before that. I was told about a saucer going down the runway at a SAC base where nuclear weapons were stored. And by definition, that's a matter of national security, because there ain't supposed to be anybody there who doesn't have a clearance, you know. And then if my wife and I are driving along and see a flying saucer, big deal, it happens all the time. And he agreed with me, 2 separate communication channels. But that raises the question, so where the heck do those reports go which could affect national security? And my answer is very simple, Operation Majestic 12. That's why I've written a book, Top Secret Magic, about Operation Majestic 12. And there's a very good, I've heard all the arguments against the documents and found that none of them stand up. So I'm convinced that it answers another question, because Office of Naval Intelligence, which is the granddaddy of the intelligence agency, they've been around a long time, They keep saying, we don't have anything on UFOs. And I got that straight from them when I asked about it. So I send the guy who tells me that a report that was jointly written by Air Force Intelligence and Naval Intelligence. Thank you very much for the interesting report, but as I told you, we have nothing about flying saucers. So I think they went to Majestic 12. Makes sense. So it's part of the picture of if you're going to have an opinion as a scientist about anything connected with flying saucers, do your darn homework.
You're right. I will say amen to doing your homework, first off. But second off, on the lighter side of things, with all the interviews that you've done and all the speeches that you've done, do you have any interesting bloopers or any interesting outtakes that have not been aired or have actually been seen that you could share with us as well too, now that we're on a little bit lighter side, now that we've covered the serious?
Well, they showed one the other day that really frosted me. I remembered it. A medical doctor, Dr. Schulman, had me on as a guest in his talk show and asked me questions like, are you crazy? You see a psychiatrist? Stuff like that. I kept my cool, but, and that was one I'm glad not too many people see it because it made me so damn angry. But I didn't show it on the tape. I've been pretty damn careful about what I say on the air, and so I got nothing I'm ashamed to having said. I'm not saying I haven't goofed on occasion, but I've enjoyed the interviews, partly because you have two different kinds of people. Those who say it's all nonsense, and those who are willing to listen. You're a scientist, you work for big companies, let's hear what you have to say. And I particularly appreciated, for example, Tom Snyder in the old Tomorrow show. I was doing the show with Betty Hill. You had Betty's niece on. And she was on first, and I was in the green room. And I came out, and I said to Tom that, people won't know that Betty was a social worker. She's not a pretentious-looking person, or she wasn't, and stuff. First thing he did when we went back on the air was ask her what her background was. The second thing with Tom Snyder, we did a good long segment. And, I was really pleased with it. And he finally stood up. He's like 6'7", his shoulders really broad, and very intimidating. Betty was 5 feet tall. I'm 5'10" on a good day, So the fact that he didn't use his size to intimidate, didn't take advantage, was I thought, very nice. I did 2 shows with Merv Griffin. I was very impressed with the quality of the questions he asked. Asking good questions is not easy. I've enjoyed the media occasions, with the exception of the one that was shown here the other day with Dr. Schulman, because I find that you can get people to think sensibly about stuff if you have the facts in hand. And they're a little bit intimidated by my being a nuclear physicist, so they don't automatically assume that I'm some kind of a nut. I mean, Westinghouse wouldn't hire a nut, would they? Well, they probably would, but, So the media experience has been interesting, let's put it that way. There are Hollywood sharks out there, and I worked on a movie flying UFOs Are Real. I was technical advisor and co-script writer and so forth, and I wasn't impressed with Hollywood, but I was impressed with the opportunity it gave me to talk to a whole bunch of people. We traveled around the country, and so I appreciate the fact that the media are important. And I did a strange thing, but I did a weekly science commentary for CBC, Canadian Broadcasting Radio, in Fredericton for 6 years. And the funniest experience was there was an earthquake there. Now, I'd been in earthquakes in California, hadn't been in one in New Brunswick for 30 years. And it was a pretty powerful earthquake. And so I went in to do an early show of my weekly show. And while I was on the air, we had an afterquake. And my wife recorded the show, and the kids are screaming. Earthquake's a pretty frightening thing. I mean, when the house is shaking, you don't know how long it's going to last and how powerful it is. You get worried, to say the least. So for weeks, I got asked at the station, "You bringing the earthquakes with you today?" So, you have adventures. But it's been a good life. Started in 58, okay, so that's 58 years now that I've been at this. And I've only had 11 hecklers with well over 700 lectures. That tells you something, Yeah, I think so.
It's been just a pleasure having you on here with us on Skywatchers Radio. And just to let the audience know, give them a website that they can follow your work. Also, any future events you're going to be on so they know how to follow you.
The website is easy, www.stantonfriedman, FRIEDMAN.com. And it lists all my books and DVDs. And it has some articles on it, and I answer my own phone. I mention it because some people are astonished. Don't I get what? No. Who's going to stalk me? I live in Frederick.
I'm actually proof of that because when I called this gentleman years ago to get him on the show, he answered his own phone. He was like, "Hello," and I'm like, "Stanton? Mr. Friedman?" He said, "Yes." I was blown away. I thought I was going to have to go through a publicist or a third party. No, he does really answer his own phone. And one of the nicest human beings you're ever going to meet, honestly speaking.
Thank you for the kind words. The bottom line is have facts in hand before getting mouthed in gear. It's a great protection against idiots.
God bless you, sir. Thank you so much for being here with us. He's been on a couple of shows that I've been either a producer or a host on, and it's an honor and a pleasure to finally meet you in person. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for being a part here and shaking my hand. And, tell the audience a little bit about yourself in case they've been living in the rock somewhere and they don't know who Stanton Friedman is at this point. Just give us a little rundown of your history.
Okay, I grew up in New Jersey. It wasn't my fault, but I and I spent 2 years at Rutgers University and then 3 years at the University of Chicago. Carl Sagan and I were classmates for 3 years. And then I went to work in industry, and in 14 years I worked for several major companies. My specialty was canceled government-sponsored research and development programs. General Electric Aircraft Nuclear Propulsion Department. Worked there in 1958. We spent Frank Edwards, who wrote a book, Flying Saucers Serious Business, which he had given me a copy of. And when I got to Pittsburgh as a Westinghouse nuclear scientist, I called Frank and said, I need some names, Frank. You know everybody. I'd like to go public. So he gave me some names, and one of them was a producer of a radio show called Contact. And I called them thinking, Westinghouse is big in Pittsburgh, and so they'll certainly want me on. Don't call us, we'll call you. Less than a month later, they called me at 6:30. Could I do the 7 o'clock show, please? Somebody had canceled at the last minute. And I lived near the station. By then, you didn't do it by phone. You went down in person. Yes. So I did that. Somebody at work, $100 million. It wasn't a small program. Employed 3,700 people, of whom 1,100 were engineers and scientists. And the program got canceled. Worked for General Nucleonics, worked on fusion study, fusion propulsion, way back in '62. Worked for General Motors on a compact nuclear reactor program, and wound up at Westinghouse Astronuclear Lab working on nuclear rocket engines. And we tested them on the ground. Unfortunately, not in space. Yeah. And I wound up, I was, crazy world how things happen. I gave my first lecture in 1967 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in somebody's living room. I'd gotten to know.
All right, now we're sitting here with a gentleman that really needs no introduction to anybody who's been a fan of ufology or a fan of the topic of UFOs, a fan of the unknown, the unexplained, that has to do with aliens. The one and the only Mr. Stanton Friedman, who also, by the way, was the second person I ever interviewed on radio. And when I contacted him, I was shaking like a leaf. I was just shaking. This man is never going to say yes to me. He's going to, just hang up the phone. And he was so nice to be on the air with us.
At Westinghouse heard me and said, her book review club is reading Frank's book. Could I give them a talk about flying saucers in her living room? That was my first lecture. And I did a bunch more lectures, did KDKA more, that program several times. And things happen in crazy ways. I'm riding to work one of 2 days. I rode to work. I worked in a small town called Large, Pennsylvania, outside of Pittsburgh. And I lived downtown, and I needed to take my car to the garage. A woman who worked at the same place, Westinghouse Astronuclear Lab, was also lived downtown, so she gave me a ride. And I was talking to her, I'd like to speak at Carnegie Mellon University.